She was 34 years old. Delia Hartwell owned nothing but the clothes on her back, 4 silver dollars sewn into her hem, and a grief so heavy it had worn a permanent stoop into her shoulders. It was her husband's brother, Silas Hartwell, who put her out of the house she had helped build with her own 2 hands, the week after her husband Thomas was buried beneath the aspens outside Coldwater Ridge, Colorado Territory. Silas said the land was his by blood and the law would agree with him, and in the autumn of 1881, in a territory where a widow's word counted for little against a man's signature, the law did agree. With her $4 and a bundle wrapped in a shawl, Delia walked up into the foothills because she did not know where else a woman with no family and no roof might go. It was there, half buried in a ravine choked with wild rose and years of fallen pine needles, that she found it, the ruin of a freight wagon, its wheels rotted, its canvas long since eaten by weather, abandoned by whoever had once driven it. The old liveryman in town, when she asked, laughed and said she could have salvage rights for $2, since no sane person would want a dead man's wagon. She paid it anyway, foolishly, desperately, because $2 was a price she could still afford and pride was the only thing she had left to spend. She did not know yet that the wagon's rear panel was not what it seemed, that something had been sealed inside it for 11 years, waiting, and that what she would find there would not only save her life but restore an entire town to what it once believed itself to be. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delia Hartwell. If you are watching this from a place that has been written off by everyone who once loved it, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Delia had not always been a woman who counted her fortune in dollars sewn into hems. She had grown up the daughter of a wheelwright in Ohio, in a house that smelled always of linseed oil and cut ash wood, and from her father, Josiah Reyes, for her mother had been of Mexican descent, a fact Delia carried quietly and proudly beneath her plain calico dresses. She had learned 2 things that would matter more than she ever imagined: how a wagon was built, board by board, joint by joint, and how to look at a thing others called broken and see instead what it had been made to hold. Josiah used to say that every wagon had a memory in its wood, that a good wheelwright could run his palm along a plank and tell you what weather it had weathered, what weight it had carried, whether it had been built by a careful man or a careless one. Delia had spent her childhood afternoons in that shop, sanding spokes until her fingers bled, listening to her father explain the difference between a panel that was simply old and a panel that had been built with a purpose folded into its bones, a false bottom for smuggling tools past a toll road, a hollow axle for hiding a strongbox from highwaymen. It was, her father said, an old trick among freighters who carried anything worth stealing. She had married Thomas Hartwell at 22, a quiet, gentle man who had gone west to Colorado Territory to work timber and later to keep books for the Bellhaven Freight Company, and she had gone with him gladly, trading Ohio's green hills for the high, thin air of the Rockies. They had no children, though they had wanted them, and in the absence of that particular joy they had built something else together, a small cabin, a garden Delia coaxed out of stony soil, a marriage built on the same patient, careful craftsmanship her father had taught her to respect in wood. Thomas often told her she had married beneath her, that a wheelwright's daughter deserved a grander life than a bookkeeper's cabin, and she always answered that she had married exactly as high as she wished to marry, because a man who listened to her was worth more than any house. She learned to read a ledger at his elbow in the evenings, learned the particular satisfaction of a column that balanced, learned that numbers, like wood, could tell the truth about a thing if you knew how to look. It was a skill she thought, at the time, was simply a way of being close to her husband. She did not yet know it would one day be the very thing that saved her. Thomas Hartwell died in the spring of 1881, thrown from a mule on a mountain trail during a supply run for the very freight company he had kept books for, and Delia's grief was still raw and unhealed when Silas Hartwell arrived from Denver with a deed in his coat pocket and a lawyer's letter in his hand. Silas was Thomas's younger brother, a man who had never much cared for the mountains or for Delia, and who had spent the years of Thomas's marriage building a name for himself in freight and mining speculation, a name built, Delia would later learn, on foundations far less honest than anyone suspected. Silas explained, not unkindly but not gently either, that the cabin and the small parcel of land beneath it had been purchased in Thomas's name using money Silas himself had lent years before, and that the paper Thomas had signed in gratitude, half forgotten, gave Silas the right to reclaim the property should Thomas die without an heir. Delia asked to see a lawyer of her own. There was none in Coldwater Ridge willing to stand against a man who controlled half the freight contracts in the county, and the one in Denver wanted more money than Delia would ever see again. She packed what she could carry in a single afternoon while Silas stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, arms folded, watching her fold linens she had sewn with her own hands, and when she asked him, quietly, whether he felt no shame turning his brother's widow into the road, he told her that shame was a luxury for people who could afford it, and that grief did not pay debts. She walked out with her shawl, her $4, and the particular, cold clarity that comes to a person only after they have lost absolutely everything and found they are still, somehow, standing. She did not go to relatives, for she had none left living. She did not go to a boarding house, for boarding houses wanted money in advance. She went up into the foothills above town because the mountains, at least, did not charge admission, and because some old instinct in her, some echo of her father's voice, told her that a woman with nothing left to lose should go and look at what everyone else had already decided was worthless. She found the wagon on the second day, in a gulch off an old freight trail that had not been used in years, its frames sunk into a decade of leaf litter, one wheel gone entirely, the canvas top rotted to lace. It had once borne the painted name of the Bellhaven Freight Company, the very company Thomas had kept books for, though the letters were now so weathered that only a woman who had spent evenings reading that name off invoices would have recognized it at all. She might have walked past it, as surely dozens of hunters and trappers had walked past it in the years since it was abandoned, except that something in her father's old training made her stop, made her run her palm along the splintered wood of the rear gate the way Josiah Reyes had taught her, feeling for the story the wood might tell. She felt it there, a seam too straight, too deliberate, hidden beneath a layer of grime and weather, the unmistakable line of a panel that had been built to open. She walked the rest of the way down into Coldwater Ridge with her heart beating harder than the climb alone could explain, and found the town's aging liveryman, a man named Otis Pruitt who remembered Thomas fondly and looked at Delia now with the particular pity reserved for widows who have lost everything. When she asked about the wagon, Otis told her it had belonged to a freighter named Ezra Colm, who had vanished 11 years earlier while hauling the season's mining payroll down from the Silver Fork claims, a payroll worth nearly $6,000 that had never been recovered. Ezra had been blamed for the theft ever since, his name spoken in Coldwater Ridge the way one speaks of a thief and a coward, his family, a wife and young daughter, driven from town in disgrace not long after, their whereabouts unknown. The wagon had been found abandoned in the mountains days after Ezra vanished, the payroll box gone, and no one since had wanted anything to do with it. Otis sold Delia the salvage rights for $2, told her she was a fool to want a dead thief's wagon, and warned her, almost as an afterthought, that Silas Hartwell himself had been the freight company's young clerk back then, the one who had first raised the alarm about the missing payroll. Delia spent that first night beside the wagon rather than return to town, too proud to ask for charity and too curious, if she was honest with herself, to leave the mystery unexamined until morning. By the gray light of dawn, working with a chisel borrowed from Otis and hands that trembled from cold and hunger both, she found the seam again and worked it loose, and the rear panel of the wagon swung open on a hidden hinge exactly as her father had once described such things swinging, revealing a shallow compartment built into the wagon's very frame, dry and undisturbed for 11 years. Inside lay not gold, not yet, but something in its way more valuable, a leather satchel containing a freighter's logbook in a careful, patient hand, 3 sealed letters addressed to a wife Ezra Colm must have hoped one day to send, and a small oilskin pouch of mining script that told her, before she had read a single word, that whatever had happened to Ezra Colm on that mountain 11 years ago, he had not run off a thief with a fortune. A thief does not hide his logbook and love letters in a false panel and walk away without them. Something else had happened to Ezra Colm, and Delia Hartwell, sitting in the cold morning light with her father's old lessons singing quietly in her hands, understood that she had not bought a worthless wagon for $2 desperate. She had bought a mystery 11 years buried, and perhaps, though she did not yet dare to hope it, a way back into a life that had every right to have ended in that ravine. The logbook, Once Delia had carried it back to the small room above Otis Pruitt's livery that he let her have in exchange for keeping his account books, told a story in Ezra Colm's own patient hand that took her 3 full days to piece together. He had written not just freight tallies but small observations, worries, the ordinary thoughts of an ordinary man, and in the final weeks before his disappearance those observations had grown sharper, more guarded, as though he sensed something was wrong before he could name it. He wrote of a young clerk at the Bellhaven office, unnamed at first out of what Delia came to understand was caution, who had begun asking too many questions about the payroll routes, who had suggested changes to the guard schedule that seemed, in hindsight, designed to leave a driver exposed rather than protected. He wrote, in an entry dated only days before he vanished, that he suspected the payroll manifest had been altered to show more silver leaving the Silver Fork claims than actually left them, the difference to be quietly skimmed and the loss blamed, if it were ever discovered, on bandits or on the driver himself. He named the clerk in that final entry, in ink gone brown with age but perfectly legible, S. Hartwell. Delia read her brother-in-law's name in a dead man's handwriting and felt the floor of her small rented room tilt beneath her as surely as if the mountain itself had shifted. The sealed letters to Ezra's wife, which Delia debated for a long, aching night whether she had any right to open, confirmed what the logbook implied, a gentle, worried husband writing to reassure a frightened wife that he intended to take his suspicions to the mine owners directly, that he trusted the law even if he did not trust young Hartwell, and that he loved her and their daughter. Nell, more than any payroll box in the territory. He had never gotten the chance to send them. The oilskin pouch of scrip, worthless now as currency but priceless as evidence, bore markings matching the Silver Fork claim office, proof that Ezra had indeed carried the payroll as assigned and had not, as the town believed, absconded with it. What became clear to Delia, turning the logbook's pages by candlelight while Otis's mules shifted and sighed in their stalls below her, was a story far larger and far crueler than a single widow's misfortune. Ezra Colm had not run off with $6,000 of miners' wages. He had been silenced, or at the very least, deliberately sent into danger, by a young clerk who then spent the next decade building a fortune in freight contracts and mining speculation on a foundation of stolen payroll and a dead man's ruined name, a foundation that had eventually grown wealthy enough to buy a cabin in his own brother's name and, years later, to reclaim that same cabin from his brother's widow with a lawyer's letter and a cold recitation about the impossibility of shame. Delia sat with that knowledge for a long while, feeling something shift inside her that was not quite grief and not quite rage but some third thing, older and steadier than either, the same clarity that had carried her up into the mountains with $4 sewn into her hem. She thought of Ezra Colm's wife and daughter, driven from Coldwater Ridge in disgrace, carrying a dishonor that was never theirs to carry, scattered somewhere in the vast unmapped territory beyond the mountains with no way of knowing the truth had been sitting sealed in a wagon panel all these years. She thought, too, of the town itself, for Coldwater Ridge had suffered when the payroll vanished, mine owners tightening wages to recover the loss, families going hungry that winter 11 years ago, a bank in town failing not long after under the strain, the whole community absorbing a wound it believed had been dealt by one desperate, dishonest freighter, when in truth the wound had been dealt by one of its own rising sons, quietly, patiently, for over a decade. Delia understood, sitting alone with candle wax pooling on the table before her, that she now held something far more dangerous than a mystery. She held proof against a man who owned half the freight contracts in the county, who had lawyers in Denver and friends among the mine owners, and who would not simply hand back a cabin and an apology if she walked into town waving a dead man's logbook. She would need to be as careful and as patient as her father had taught her to be with wood, reading the grain before she cut, understanding the whole shape of the thing before she risked breaking it. She did not act rashly. She spent the following week doing what she had always done best, what Thomas had trained in her at his own elbow over years of quiet evenings. She built a ledger of her own, cross-referencing the freight company's public shipping records, which Otis Pruitt still kept boxed in his loft from his years supplying the company's mules, against the manifest numbers written in Ezra Colm's careful hand. The discrepancies were there, small and precise, exactly as a man who had learned to skim rather than steal outright would leave them, $100 here, $300 there, always attributed afterward to spoilage, spillage, the ordinary shrinkage of a freight business, until across a decade they summed to a fortune large enough to explain every acre Silas Hartwell now owned. When she finally brought her findings to Otis Pruitt and to the town's aging notary, a careful man named Absalom Free who had known both Hartwell brothers since they were boys, word reached Silas within a day, as she had known it would in a town as small as Coldwater Ridge. He came to the livery himself, immaculately dressed, his voice pitched to that same reasonable, patient tone he had used the day he put her out of her own kitchen, and he told her plainly that a widow with a dead thief's logbook and a grudge would find no court in the territory willing to take her word over his, that she was, in his gentle and terrible phrasing, chasing ghosts because she had nothing else left to chase. He offered her, as if it were generosity, $20 to leave Coldwater Ridge quietly and never speak Ezra Colm's name again. Delia looked at the man who had once called her family and told him, with a calm that surprised even herself, that she had spent her whole life learning to read what other people called worthless, and that she would rather starve honest than eat comfortable on his silence. Silas did not threaten her outright, for he was too careful a man for that, but in the days that followed she felt his influence close around her like a fist inside a velvet glove. Otis Pruitt was reminded, by a man claiming to represent the freight company, that his livery lease was due for renewal and that Bellhaven's business made up half his income. The notary Absalom Free received a visit from a Denver lawyer suggesting that questioning a respected freight man's decade-old business practices, based on the ravings of a supposed thief, might expose him to a suit for slander. Word moved through Coldwater Ridge, seated quietly at the general store and the assay office, that the widow Hartwell had gone strange up in the mountains, that grief had turned her mind toward wild stories about a dead man's stolen wagon. Delia felt the town's sympathy, which had been hers by right as Thomas's widow, curdling slowly into the particular suspicion small places reserve for anyone who threatens to disturb their comfortable understanding of themselves. She might have given up then, might have taken the $20 and vanished into the vastness of the territory the way Ezra Colm's own wife and daughter had vanished, except that she thought of Nell Colm, a girl who would now be nearly grown, carrying a disgrace that belonged to someone else entirely, and she thought of her father's voice telling her that a good wheelwright finished the joint he started, however long it took the glue to set. She wrote, instead, a careful letter to the Territorial Mining Commission in Denver, enclosing copies of her comparisons and a plain, unembellished account of what she had found, addressed not to a court that might dismiss a widow's word but to an auditor whose entire professional reputation rested on catching exactly the kind of quiet, decade-long theft she had uncovered. The commission's auditor, a dry, meticulous man named Corwin Ashby who had spent 20 years chasing precisely this sort of slow embezzlement through the mining camps of Colorado, arrived in Coldwater Ridge on a gray morning 3 weeks later, and it was here that the town, and Silas Hartwell, learned that Delia Hartwell had not been chasing ghosts at all. Ashby spent 4 days in the freight company's back office with Otis Pruitt's boxed records and Delia's careful cross-references, and at the end of it he told the assembled town, in the plain hall above the general store where the mine owners and freighters and shopkeepers of Coldwater Ridge had gathered half in curiosity and half in disbelief, that the discrepancies were undeniable, that they traced back consistently and precisely to the accounts under young Hartwell's supervision, and that the pattern matched exactly the kind of skimming a man might attempt if he first needed to silence a driver who had grown suspicious of him. Silas, to his credit or perhaps simply because he had run out of velvet for his glove, did not deny it outright when confronted with his own decade-old alterations laid plainly beside Ezra Colm's honest manifest numbers. He grew instead very quiet, the reasonable patience gone from his voice at last, and asked only, in a tone Delia had never heard from him before, how she had found it. She told him, simply, that her father had taught her what remembers what it was built to hold, and that some things, however carefully hidden, are built to be found by someone patient enough to look. Justice in Coldwater Ridge, that autumn, did not come as a hanging or a dramatic arrest, for the territory's slow machinery of law moved as it always did, with warrants and hearings and the tedious unwinding of a decade's false paperwork, but it came all the same. Silas Hartwell's freight contracts, the foundation of his fortune, were suspended pending the commission's full accounting, and the cabin he had reclaimed from Delia under a debt that Ashby's investigation revealed had itself been partly paid down using skimmed payroll money, was returned to her by order of the same commission that had once seemed as distant and unreachable as the moon. But Delia did not want the cabin most of all, not anymore, not once she understood what restoring it would truly mean. She used the recovered mining scrip, verified now by the commission as genuine claim currency still redeemable against the Silver Fork Mines records, along with a portion of the seized funds the commission awarded her as the one who had uncovered the theft, to do something Coldwater Ridge had not expected from the strange widow who had bought a dead thief's wagon for $2. She rebuilt what the theft had broken. The bank that had failed the winter of Ezra's disappearance had left behind small, aging debts still owed to families who had never been repaid, farmers and shopkeepers who remembered that hard winter without ever knowing its true cause. Delia paid what she could of those old debts quietly, through Absalom free, without ever putting her own name to the kindness. She commissioned a modest stone marker to be placed not in the churchyard, for no body had ever been found, but at the head of the mountain trail where the wagon had lain forgotten, bearing Ezra Colm's name and the plain words a wrongly accused man deserved: driver, husband, father, honest to the end. And she spent the better part of a month, with Otis Pruitt's help and letters sent to every mining office and territorial registrar she could reach, searching for Nell Colm, the daughter driven from town as a child under a shame that was never hers, until a reply finally came from a schoolteacher in a town called Buena Vista confirming that a Nell Colm, now a grown young woman working as a seamstress, had indeed once lived in Coldwater Ridge and had often spoken, sadly, of the father she still believed had shamed them. When Nell Colm arrived in Coldwater Ridge that November, and stood at the stone marker on the mountain trail reading her father's name restored to honesty at last, Delia understood, watching from a respectful distance, that this was the true purchase she had made with her $2 desperate, not a wagon, not even the truth of a theft, but the chance to hand a stranger's daughter back her father's good name, the one thing money alone could never have bought her. And so we return, as we always do, to where this story began, to a woman of 34 with $4 sewn into her hem, standing before an abandoned wagon that everyone else in Coldwater Ridge had long since decided was worthless. It would have been easy, that cold autumn morning, for Delia Hartwell to walk past that ravine the way so many others had walked past it for 11 years, to let the wagon rot quietly into the mountainside along with whatever secrets it held. She did not walk past it, not because she knew what waited behind its rear panel, but because her father had taught her, long before grief and betrayal ever touched her life, that value does not announce itself loudly, that the things a careless world calls broken often hold within them exactly what a patient hand needs to set right. Delia never did move back into the cabin Silas Hartwell once tried to steal from her. She gave it instead to a young family left destitute by that same old bank failure, and took for herself only the small room above Otis Pruitt's livery, the wagon itself restored and standing now beside the trailhead marker as a kind of monument to a truth 11 years buried. What Delia Hartwell found in the mountains was never only gold or scrip or evidence, though it was all of those things too. What she found, in the end, was proof of something she had believed all along without quite knowing how to say it, that a life stripped down to almost nothing can still hold within it the patience, the skill, and the stubborn decency to build something whole again. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Delia's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless, and we invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every answer, and we are always glad to have you with us. Until next time, stay close.